how much trouble would you want there not to be? It's a weird question, right? Because you want to have something to contend with. You want to have something that forces from you the best that you have. And so you have to have real problems. It's something like that. Would you dispense with all your real... You could just lay down on a bed and have pablum infused into your mouth, you know, if all your problems were solved. And so maybe you want difficult problems that you can solve, something like that, because there's some... I don't know what it is about it. There's the overcoming and the growth that comes along with that. There's something about the nobility of the enterprise. You certainly see that when you go about having children, for example, which is, you know, the psychological literature is quite clear. If you do moment-to-moment comparisons of people who have kids and people who don't have kids, the people who don't have kids are happier. And so psychologists who tend to get things wrong even when they make intelligent discoveries like that one, immediately, some of them, jump to the conclusion that because happiness is the goal, that, well, there's something about children that, you know, make you unhappy, and that's not good. It's like, well, wait a second. Maybe that's the wrong metric. It's like, of course you're less happy once you have children because you have to worry about them. You know, my neighbor down the street, who's a very smart woman, said to me once, you can only be as happy as your unhappiest child. And which I thought was really good, you know, that's really smart. But then it isn't, well, if having children doesn't make you happy, the answer isn't don't have children. It's like, don't be so stupid about being happy. That's the answer. It's because there's a nobility in the pursuit, right? And of course now you're responsible. You know, you have a new baby, you think, especially if you're a new parent, you think, what the hell is this? And what am I going to do with it? You know, it's like, and then you're done for the rest of your life. You never sleep properly again because you're going to be worried about this creature that you have to take care of. But like, what the hell good are you if you're not doing that, or something else equally difficult? Because you just haven't been called out yet, unless you take on a responsibility like that. The idea that life is, you know, that happiness is the purpose of life. It's like, great for happiness, man. If it comes along, you should be thrilled that it's visiting you. But the notion that that's what you should pursue, that's the weakest possible notion. First of all, as soon as something terrible happens to you, you're done. It's like, life is to be happy. It's like, well, now you have cancer. So how's that? How's the happiness thing working out for you now? Or maybe it's not you, you know, maybe it's your father that has Alzheimer's disease or some damn thing. And, you know, it's like, it's a rare person that doesn't have some catastrophe one person away from them. It's like, life is to be happy. That's not right. And we can at least derive that from these stories. That isn't what they say at all. God's perfectly happy in the stories to grant the people with whom he forms a covenant happiness and prosperity. But there's never a word that that's the purpose. The rule is, aim high and get your bloody act together. That's the rule. And establish this contractual covenant with the ultimate ideal. And that will see you through the catastrophes. And that's a much more mature way of looking at life, as far as I'm concerned, because all you have to do is have your eyes half open and you see that the fundamental reality of life is tragedy and suffering. That's inescapable. That doesn't mean that it makes life unbearable, or that it makes being something that shouldn't have existed. Right? That isn't what it means. But it means that you have to contend with it and you have to get ready. And the willingness to adopt responsibility for yourself and for others is the precondition for that. And then maybe if you do that properly, then now and then you get some happiness. You know, you can sit at the end of a day and you have half an hour where your conscience is clear and there's nothing that you need to be doing, and you can relax and think, you know, that's all right. Things are okay. And thank God for that. And that's maybe where you get your happiness. So, yeah, that's something. That's growing up, man, obviously. And to not know that, and to not be taught that. Like, everyone should be taught that. It's so obvious.
Sure. Hi, Dr. Peterson. Over the last couple of weeks and further back, you talk a lot about consciousness and the importance of it. And I was hoping to get your opinion on an issue of consciousness that has often seen Christianity, among other groups, and politics kind of clash. So I'm hoping to get your views on the consciousness or lack thereof of a human fetus, and how that's impacted your views on abortion, whatever they are, and any legislation surrounding that.
Oh. Thank you. Okay, so the first question is, do I have an answer for that that's a good enough answer to actually reveal? No, I don't, but I can flail about a little bit around it. Abortion is clearly wrong. I don't think anybody debates that. You wouldn't recommend that someone that you love have one. Okay, now, having clarified that, that mere statement doesn't eliminate the complexity of the situation. The first question is should everything wrong be illegal? That's a tough question. Everything that's wrong isn't illegal. Then there's the additional complication of the difference, let's say, in gravity regarding the problem in relationship to men and women. And we don't know how to deal with that. Having said that, I would say that it's actually the wrong question. There's something Leonard Cohen said once. He said that in a massacre, there's no decent place to stand. And what he meant by that was sometimes you're where there is no good decision left. No matter what you do, it's wrong. So then the question is, how did you get there? Well, let's say you're in a position where you are inclined to seek an abortion. The question is, how did you get there? Now, we have a lot to straighten out about the sexual relationships between men and women in the modern world. They're bent and warped and demented out of shape. One of the things I see with young people, for example, is that they will engage in sexual acts with one another that they would not talk about with one another. I mean, couples will do that for that matter, like married couples will do that, but they're married. That's a different story. It seems to me that if you are willing to engage in a sexual act with someone with whom you would not discuss that act, you probably put the cart before the horse. So, the discussion regarding the legality of abortion is nested inside a larger discussion about the morality of abortion, and that's nested inside a larger discussion about the proper place of sexuality in human behavior. And to me, that's the level at which the problem needs to be addressed. Now, I don't have the answer to that, because the old answer was get married. That's a good answer. And it's an answer that people should still listen to. But we'll put that aside momentarily. I had a client at one point who was, I don't know, she was probably, I'm going to disguise her in a variety of different ways. She was 27, 20, thereabouts, had come from a relatively conservative background, quite a timid, fearful person, and also not very well, not sophisticated in relationship to relationships. And she'd never had sex. Well, there's a bunch of things she'd never done. Well, the answer from me to her wasn't continue to be timid about everything, because that wasn't working out for her. She needed to go have some adventures. Now, sexual adventures, like other adventures, are dangerous. And so you have to be very careful when you encourage people to go out and have adventures. But too much timidity and caution also constitutes a pathway to perdition, let's say. You can't just say to people in the modern world, well, no sex till you're married, unless you're going to get married when you're very young, and perhaps you should. I don't know about that. But I don't think that we're mature enough as a culture to have a serious discussion about sexual propriety, especially in the aftermath of the birth control pill. And we seriously need to do that. And we haven't. And so I think the eternal debate about abortion, horrible as it is it's the surface manifestation of a much deeper problem. Now, I talked a little bit today about the utility of marriage, like the spiritual utility of marriage. And that's something that I think we're so immaturely cynical as a culture. Like we're not wise enough to look at an institution like marriage and to really think about what it means and what it signifies. It signifies a place that people can tie the ropes of their lives together so that they're stronger. It signifies a place where people can tell the truth to one another. It signifies a place where sexuality can properly be integrated into life. That's no easy task. It's a place where children, at least in principle, can be put first and foremost as they should be once they exist. And so there's a much broader discussion that has to happen, I think, before any concentration on the legality of abortion is liable to get anywhere at all. That's what it looks like to me. So that's the best I can do with that question. What do you make of the manosphere's claim that women's liberation has led to our weakened ability to pair bond, the breakdown of the institution of marriage, and sexual inequity in favor of alpha men? I guess probably I would say that to the degree that all of that is true, I wouldn't say that the women's liberation movement is what's done it, because I don't believe that the women's liberation movement is the primary driver of women's liberation. In fact, I think it's a secondary consequence of a far more radical biological revolution, and that's the invention of the birth control pill, right? Because the birth control pill essentially allowed females for the first time in evolutionary history to gain voluntary control over the reproductive function. And a tremendous amount of political upheaval followed in the aftermath of that. And, you know, people who were engaged in that political upheaval like to think about it as causal, because they like to think that their efforts, say, on agitating in favor of women's equal rights, it was actually the causal factor that produced the sociological transformation. But I think the evidence for that is extraordinarily weak, given the unbelievable magnitude of the birth control pill. So with the birth control pill, women become more like men, much more like men. And also, it seems to be the case that women on the birth control pill don't like masculine men as much. There's studies showing that, for example, if you show women the face of the same man at different, or the same men at different phases of their ovulatory cycle, and all you do is widen the jaw or narrow the jaw of the men, that the women at the peak of their ovulation, where they're maximally fertile, like the wide-jawed men better, but when they're infertile, they like the narrow-jawed men better, and wider-jawed men have higher levels of testosterone, and the pill mimics infertility. And so, you know, we don't know what these radical biological hormonal transformations have done to the relationship between men and women. And you know, women too are trying to experiment with their new mode of being. It's like, well, now they're not destined at an early age to transform themselves into mothers, or to allow themselves to be transformed by nature into mothers, even though it's possible that they might be much happier if that happened. I'm not saying that that's necessarily the case, but there is good evidence that women's general level of unhappiness has increased since the early 1960s. What has been the consequence of that? Well, the first consequence was wild sexual experimentation. And why not? What would you expect? It's like all of a sudden reproduction's under control. Does that mean that women can be as promiscuous as men? Well, maybe that's what it means. We don't know. So that was part of the big 60s experiment, and it isn't obvious that went particularly well. It certainly led to the pornographication of our society, which I really think is actually quite dreadful. Maybe that's my innate prudishness, but I don't know. It seems to me that pornography demeans the participants as well as the viewers. There's something second-rate and furtive about it, and I think that everybody who engages in it knows that. It's a substitute for the real adventure of life. And I do think that it leads to a certain kind of, perhaps, contempt. It leads to contempt, I would say. And that can't be a good thing. I mean, I don't ever think, and you guys can ask yourself this question, I mean, have you ever met anybody who finished masturbating and then was proud about it, and who stood up straighter because of it, and who felt that they'd really conquered life as a consequence? I mean, I just don't believe that's the general post masturbation feeling. I don't believe that. I believe that it's something you do when you don't have the right thing to do, and it's an admission that you're a second-rate player, essentially, something like that. So the pornographication was a bad thing. The fact that, I mean, women's lives have been complicated too, I would say, by this transformation too, because it isn't easy now for women to decide that they want to make being a mother
a primary focus of their life, because increasingly it's necessary for families to have two incomes. And I think the reason for that, there's two reasons for that. One is that when women started to flood into the labor market was approximately the same time that the market started to open to places like India and China, and working wages started to flatten. But then you also have the fact that if you double the labor pool by introducing women into it, perhaps you half the value of labor, and that might, maybe you do even worse than that. If women are more agreeable and more likely to work part-time and more willing to take lesser hours and lower pay, which seems to be the case, then maybe you flatten the labor market even more. So in terms of increasing sexual inequity in favor of alpha men, well, anything that breaks down pair bonding, matrimony is going to do that, because sexual access for males is a Pareto-distributed phenomena, where a small proportion of the males get most of the invitations, let's say. And the thing that is a bulwark against that is monogamy. And part of the reason that societies are set up to be monogamous is so that that proclivity is controlled, because it's not good for children, let's say, if they don't have access to a father, and it's not good for women if they're all competing for the same men, and then it's not good for the men who aren't being chosen because they're not being chosen. And so that just seems to be a recipe for resentment and an aggression. And I think the evolutionary psychology data on that's pretty clear. So don't underestimate the significance of the birth control pill. It's like the hydrogen bomb or the computer chip. It's a world revolutionary technology, and for all we know, it might do us in. In the West, the birth rate is far below replacement, and that's as a multi-generational strategy. That's an